Hey guys, welcome to another episode of Foresight TV. I've got my good friend Russell Rush on with me today. But before we get started, I want to say thank you so much for watching. I know that Foresight is honestly not the place for everyone. But if you are in senior living and you're committed to creating great experiences for residents, team members, and family members, this is the place for you. So I'm really glad you're here today. First thing is, I'd love to hear from you about what you're doing to improve the lives of residents and team members. I'm sure you've got something great we should be talking about. Maybe we could have you on as a guest for Foresight TV, like I've got Russell on today. And then the second thing is that if there are things you think we should be talking about that we're not, or we should be talking about differently, I'd love to hear about that as well. I had a conversation today with somebody who said, you know what? You spend too much time talking about problems and you don't go deep enough in solutions. So I love my critics. I learn more from them than I do from the positive, but don't stop the positive stuff either. So in addition to Foresight TV, we put out all sorts of really great content. We've got LinkedIn posts, we've got the Foresight podcast, Tech Tuesday, and perhaps the most impactful thing that we actually do is the Foresight website, where we publish new leadership content every day. It's free. It's easy to subscribe to. You can see the QR code there, or there's also a link in the chat. And put your name and email in, and you will be good to go. I appreciate your passion for our industry and for the people we serve. Hey guys, Steve Moran here. Hey Russell, welcome. Let's start with a little bit about who you are and what your expertise is.
Well, I'm the managing director of R3R1 Consulting Group, and we are experts in lease-ups, impact projects, consulting, education in the senior living sales arena. So that's our focus, is not marketing, sales, conversions. And basically, we're efficiency experts. We're about making people much more efficient at their jobs.
Okay, and let's talk a little bit. Actually, I want to do one other thing first. If you're watching, you might see this weird banner back there. I turned 70 this week, and that was 1955. And this was something that my wife got for a birthday party she held for me this last week. And so it's all kinds of things that happened in 1955. I know I've got the 1955 half cut off, but that's what that is. Just so you're not trying to look through there and read. So Russell, I actually we're going to spend most of our time talking about storytelling. And I would like to, before we actually jump into storytelling, I'd like to actually talk a little bit more about how efficient you are in selling. Tell me about your numbers and where you get involved in selling senior living.
Right. So my company, we're hired to do numerous things. On the front lines, we're hired either to impact a project. So that is a community that's normally launched by a developer, and then they have some failure, and then we come in and help them turn the community around and fill it back up. Or we've been hired to do lease ups, and normally the developer we primarily work for, we've done 14 projects for this developer, which is a lot of projects. They normally are hiring us to do them when they think there's risk, where they don't believe their normal group that works for them and their management company is going to be successful. So they normally give us the most difficult projects, ones that have lower demand or a lot of competition, where they're questioning why they built that community in that particular location. And so we've been doing this for years, and we've been able to produce some incredible results because we use a completely different approach than is traditionally used by most people selling senior living services, bottom line.
Okay. And so can you talk a little bit about kind of your results? And what I'm really looking for is that if you get, I don't know, 50 leads, how many of those are going to contract and move in.
Good. So I'll use leads. We convert a very high percentage of qualified leads. In terms of meetings, which most people in the senior living business would call tours, we call those meetings because we don't just do traditional tours. We convert. So if we have 10 meetings, which most people would call tours, we would get about 9 out of 10 to select an apartment on the first encounter with them, the first meeting. And then of that 10, 7 of them will move in. So 2 will cancel on us and will not move in. But if you look at the numbers, it comes out to about a 70% conversion rate on first-time tours. Why that's so impactful, Steve, you understand, is because many of these projects have very little tours. So if we're averaging 3 or 4 tours a week, we're still able to rapid fill a community that otherwise, if we were converting 20% or less, or we were having to have multiple meetings with these individuals, then we would have very poor results. I think it comes out to almost 30% of contacts. So if someone contacts us, we convert almost 30% of those people, but a lot of those people weren't willing to present and meet with us on a favorable basis, which is part of the definition of a prospect.
Right. Okay. So one of the things that I know you do, so every time I get on a call with you, you always have stories. And the stories are a big part of what you of your sales process. And so I would, and I'm going to set I want to do a little bit of background setup here. It feels like when I first started Foresight 14 years ago, I'd go to conferences, and on a fairly regular basis, somebody would walk up to me and say, "Hey, Steve, I've got a story." And they tell me this marvelous story mostly about changing the lives of residents, but also sometimes changing the lives of family members and sometimes team members. And I don't feel like I hear nearly as many stories as I used to. I'm not quite sure why that is. I think part of it is social media, but but they're so important because they're probably the single best way to break people's preconceived notions about what senior living is, right? Because you can touch people's hearts. So talk to me a little bit about how you think about stories, how you go about collecting them, and that kind of thing.
Well, we do a lot of storytelling. You're 100% right during the social proof or evidence part of our presentations. And so that storytelling mostly revolves around socialization. 90% of the residents that move into communities we're leasing up are single individuals. And then many times they're suffering from the effects of social isolation. They've lost a companion, many times a spouse. And then they've been at home for, 3, 4, 5, 6, sometimes many more years by themselves, and their social circles collapsed. And so they're suffering from social isolation and the effects of that. And so we talk a lot about the benefits of being with people, eating food with people, exercising with people, having fun with people, and being part of a close-knit community. And so we build a series of stories around people who we've already moved into communities that had great outcomes, because everything is about their outcome of being happier, number one, healthier, and safer living in a retirement community. And so we have a series, and some of these stories are funny and others are just more anecdotal, where we're just helping them understand that they're going to have a better outcome if they free themselves from the prison of their home and come live with other humans. And so we have a very positive approach to persuading people. Rather than focusing on ADLs completely, we're going to do the cooking, cleaning, shopping, fixing. We're going to care for you. We're going to make sure you get help with a shower, a medication. That's great. But that's really not the focus of our presentations. The focus of our presentations are people.
Okay, so it's happier, healthier, and what's the third one?
Safe.
Huh? And safe. Okay.
And safe.
Okay. Happy, healthier, and safe. So
right.
Let's actually, why don't you give me some examples of some stories?
So one of the stories I like to tell is I met this woman 15 years ago when I just started to figure out the business. And her husband had died. She came to the community. She was a poet. She was a writer. She had like 6 published books. Very interesting woman. And I told her, you could. She was still healthy. She was going to Machu Picchu, to hike Machu Picchu. So you had to be pretty healthy to do that. But she was 80 years old. So I talked to her. I said, you can stay home by yourself, but it's going to affect your life. If you come and live with people, you're going to have a much more robust life. Her name's Pamela. And so the interesting part of this story is she moved in the community. She would do poetry readings with the residents. She still does, interestingly enough. And today, Pamela's 95 years old. She's lived in the community for 15 years. And been a contributing member of this community and had a wonderful 15 years of life. And so the question is, would Pamela even be alive if she had stayed home by herself?
So do you ask that blunt a question?
Yes.
When you're talking to a prospect?
100%. 100%. I asked the question, do you think Pamela would still be alive? And the answer is probably not. No, because she would have died from the effects of social isolation and most likely in a much higher medical facility. But that's just realistic. It's just reasonable. And so she gave up some freedom of being at home by herself, I guess if you call that freedom. And that's one of the things we talk about. That's part of our storytelling. We know that reactance, or the fear of being told what to do, is a big obstacle of people moving into the community. So one of the things we talk to them about is we say there really aren't that many rules in a senior living community. There's only 3 major rules. Don't walk around the halls naked with a gun while smoking. Those are 3 things that are going to irritate management. Are you planning on doing any of those things? They say, no, I don't smoke. I don't have a gun. I'll get rid of my gun and I'm not a streaker. Okay. So this is the kind of dialogue we're having with them. But the reason we have that dialogue is we're trying to reduce their resistance to living among other people and being told what to do. And so a lot of what we do is we talk about residents working in the independent living outside the community or volunteering in the community, and some of them having incredible outcomes. I could tell a quick story about that. So I have a resident in the first story I told you was in Arizona. This next one, because we work all over the country, was in Massachusetts. So we have a retired dentist. His name's Joe. Ironically, he just called me the other day. I moved him in the community 8 years ago. He calls me every single year, twice a year. He invites me to come have a martini with him. Anyway, so he called. We were in the community. Joe's family owned a Italian restaurant in Boston, but he was a dentist, but he grew up in the Italian restaurant. And one day he was telling me, he said, Russell, I'd like to cook my family recipes for my fellow residents here. So I said, Joe, let's do it. Let's make it happen. I said, how many people would you like to cook for? He said, I'd cook for a couple hundred people. So I said, no problem. So I got the executive chef. I said, Joe here wants to prepare all his family recipes for the residents and their families. Let's have an event. We'll hire entertainment and let's do it. Let's get behind Joe. So we did. So we went in the kitchen. He worked with the staff for a week. We had a big party, scheduled party. We brought in entertainment, and Joe helped them cook off all the recipes. We served everybody. Everybody had a fabulous time. So then it became an annual event, and they did it every single year after I left. And so where would Joe be if he wasn't living in the community? He would have been by himself at home. He wouldn't have had the opportunity to share his family recipes with hundreds of people in the community. And so this is all about people. Everything we do is about being with people. Can I share another story from that community?
You can, but I want to pause you for just a second. So one of the things I think people worry about is how do they go from, here's the dining room, tell me about your needs. How do they get to this part where they say, You just say, "Can I tell you a story?"
No, I'm sitting down with them. Before I ever show anybody the community, I sit down and talk with people for about an hour. The first 30 minutes is just getting to know me. And I'm telling stories about my life on the farm in Kansas and, raising vegetables and pigs and riding horses and all the things we did in Kansas when I was a child, so that they get to know me and I hear their family stories. So we're relating. Then when we get to the reasoning part of my presentation, when I get to the outcomes part of my presentation, I tell them some anecdotal stories about residents who moved in and were having very serious problems, who had incredible outcomes. And that's what I'm doing. So I'm using them. I tell them that people live longer and they're happier and healthier and safer living in communities. Now let me give you some examples. And then I'll give them some examples of real live residents that I've known for years and helped. And these same residents, they stay in touch with me.
Cool. Okay, now let's go on to that story you were going to tell me about the other person in that same community.
There was a lady, she contacted me. She was 74 years old. We were an independent living community. And I talked to her. I said, why do you want to live in the community? It's one of the questions I ask everybody who comes to see. I say, because I want to find out what their motive is. So I say, why are you looking into a retirement community? Why would you live here? And she said, Russell, I'm depressed. My husband left me 5 years ago. He was my manager. I'm a professional musician. I'm a pianist. And when he left me, my whole world collapsed. I stopped performing. I stopped traveling. She was an internationally known pianist. And she said, my whole world caved in and I'm depressed. I need to do something different. I said, you need people. Are you seeing any people? Are you spending any time with people? She said, no, I'm just staying in my house all day long. I don't see people. I'm depressed. I said, well, you do need to move in and live with me. I said, well, when you move in and live with us, we have a grand piano in the lobby. You could play it. She said, I don't play the piano anymore. I've retired. I gave that up when my husband left me. I said, okay. Her name was Ann. I said, okay, Ann, no problem. So she moved in. So about a week or two after she moved in, she started getting happier. She was eating the meals in the dining room, spending time with people. And one day I saw Ann walk through the dining room and she took one finger and touched the key on the piano. Ding! So I saw her out of the corner of my eye. Well, I'm also a musician. I'm a percussionist, sort of musician. And so I saw her. So then I thought, And so this went on. A couple of weeks later, I went to Ann. I said, Ann, would you play for us for 20 minutes after dinner some night? She said, Russell, I told you I'm retired. I don't play the piano anymore professionally. And if I did, you would have to pay me. I said, well, what if I paid you $200 to play for me for 20 minutes? My own money. Would you do it? She said, nah. So a few days later, I came to her and I said, Ann, what if I gave you $300? Would you do it? Now, she doesn't know I'm going to $1,000 of my own money, because I know if I can get her to play, she'll restart her life. So she said, no. So next week, went back. Ann, would you do it for $400? No. 20 minutes, Ann, just 20 minutes. No. Next week, $500. Maybe. You'd pay me $500 to pay for 20 minutes? Yeah, sure. She said, let me think about it. She came back to me and said, I'll do it, but I'm going to need to practice. I haven't played in 5 years. I said, Ann, why don't you practice here at the dining room at night when everybody's gone to bed? She said, okay. So we set it up. She did it. She played for us for 20 minutes. You know what she did then? She went back to work. She got a quartet. She started traveling again, and she's a professional musician to this day. She calls me every year, tells me I saved her life. She still lives in the community. She's been there for 8 years, and she's having an incredible life. And I have pictures of her. I have a video of her playing the piano, playing Rachmaninoff in C minor, and I also have pictures of her from the paper in Boston with her and her quartet and her story. So she was depressed. She'd been divorced from her husband. Her whole world had caved in, and we saved her life. And she's living a happy life in our community.
Okay. So these are really good stories. I want to push back on you a little bit. These are really great stories, but these are like really unusual people who had unusual talents. Do you have any stories about just ordinary people whose lives got changed?
I do. I have one from the community I'm at right now. So I have a guy, he's 90 years old. His name's Frank. And Frank came over to the community. He said, my wife died 2 years ago. I've been by myself in a regular multifamily apartment. He'd sold his house. It was too much for him. And he said, I think maybe I need to live in a community. I said, Frank, you definitely need people. You need people desperately. And he was just skin and bones. He looked terrible. 90 years old, but he drove himself over to see me. He brought his son back. I convinced him to move in. 2 months after he was living in the community, he had put on 21 pounds. Because we eat 50% more food if we eat with another person, because we're humans. And we were feeding him 3 meals a day. 6 options for breakfast, 9 options for lunch, 6 options for dinner. The guy put on 21 pounds. He looks like a completely different human. One of his sons lives right around the corner from us, and he comes by every Friday and eats with his dad. The other son lives out of town. The other son came in about a week ago and saw his dad and said, "Who is this?" I said, "That's your dad. He looks 10 years younger." Fantastic, because he was suffering from the effects of social isolation, which one of those is poor nutrition. That's one example. I can give you 5 more from the community I'm at right now.
So do you, when you do a sales presentation, when you work with a prospect, how many stories do you typically tell?
Between mine and residents, probably 10.
That takes a long time, doesn't it?
Oh, I'm with them. An average meeting time with a new potential resident is between an hour and a half and 2 hours. I'm in absolutely no hurry whatsoever, because I'm only going to have 3 or 4. Last week, it was an unusual week. I had 7 opportunities last week. Very unusual. The week before that, I think I had 2 or 3. So if I'm only going to have 3 or 4 opportunities in a 5 or 6 day period, I'm going to take my time with this individual and give them as much time as I can, because I want to convince them or persuade them to move into the community as soon as they can.
Okay, I want to ask a little. This isn't exactly storytelling, but I think this is really worth talking about. Don't you find that people aren't willing to? Are people willing to spend an hour and a half or 2 hours with you?
Well, sometimes they can feel. I've had residents feel like they don't come in realizing that they're going to sit down and talk to me. They think they're coming in to be walked around the inside of a community and have somebody spew, "Hey, we do the cooking, cleaning, shopping, fixing, driving, and we do baths and we do showers and all that normal stuff that people do at senior living communities." But that's not what we do. So when they come and meet with me, they realize quickly this person has a different agenda. Now, some people will object. One time when I was in Atlanta, I sat down with a family and started going through my stuff. And the son-in-law who was there said, "We don't want to talk about all this stuff. We want to see an apartment." I said, "Really?" He said, "Yes." So I said, "Let's go see one," because now he's knocking me off track. So I stood up. I walked him into a model. I sat on the couch and said, "Take a look around." Now, when they got done looking at the model, they sat down on the couch by me, and I started all over. "So tell me, where are you from?" Yeah. And we did the whole meeting right there in the model. And I moved his mom into a 1-bedroom apartment. I signed him up that day, the first time I met them, and she painted the inside of it yellow.
So do you write your stories down? How do you think about collecting stories?
I do write them down. I have a number of my stories written down, and I have certain favorite stories, and I tell stories that are appropriate to the person that I'm dealing with, because Steve, I've done 2,200 move-ins over the last 14 years. So I have thousands of residents I've dealt with, moved in, and had relationships with. So I have that advantage. But I pick the best story that's most appropriate for the person I'm talking to. So if I'm dealing with a 90-year-old, I'll tell stories about 90-year-olds. If I'm dealing with an 80-year-old, I'll tell stories about an 80-year-old. So if I'm dealing with a couple, I would tell a story about a couple.
So for somebody, so you've been doing this, you've got this huge story bank, right?
Yes.
What do you do if you're just starting out or maybe you just haven't really thought about stories? Do you have any suggestions for people?
Yes, borrow some. Try to get with your peers, talk about stories, because they're all the same people. Obviously, our residents meet demographics. Most of them are single women. Then we have a percentage of single men. Our smallest group are couples. And so learn stories about people and then use those stories as antidotes, because the resident and their family members, their influencers, want to have a good outcome. They want to be convinced it's worth the effort to give up their privacy and go live with a bunch of people they don't know. And so we have to do a lot of persuading. If residents and family members were readily buying our service, all of our communities would be full right now. We'd have a line out the door. That's not what's going on. So people need persuasion when they show up to a community to decide to go ahead and move in. And they're going to make a decision, Steve, and they're going to make it right now. So if we do not persuade them, pretty much when we meet them, they're just going to go home and talk themselves out of this whole thing and not move in, maybe ever. So one of the things that we do in the senior living business is we persuade ourselves that we can chase them for months and chase them down. But that's not reality. Again, if that was the case, we would have chased down enough people to fill up all the communities by now, but we haven't.
So, and I know one of the things you actually don't do second meetings or tours with people generally, right?
No, they're just retours. When somebody comes back, they've already selected an apartment. All we're doing is talking about when they're going to move in, what they're moving in. If they want to switch apartments, that'll happen sometimes. Maybe they want a little bigger one or a little smaller one, but they've already made the decision to move in. So 90% of the people who we meet with on the first meeting will commit to moving in, and 70%, two of the group will cancel, and 7 will move in. And the 7 that move in, they'll keep coming back over and over and over to look at things, measure, those kind of things, planning. But that's all it is. We're not touring them. It's all, the decision's already made. So at that point, so again, it's a different process. So rather than just showing people around, running them off, and then chasing them for months and getting a small percentage of them, we persuade them the first time they come in to make a decision, and then get them to actually move in.
Which is why the storytelling, of course, is so important, because that's part of the process. So one other question I want to touch bases on is how to tell a good story. So I've been asking people to tell me stories about the impact of their communities, and people have been telling me stories, and I don't want to be too more specific because I don't want to insult anybody here, but sometimes people have told me stories where I think if I knew more about the story, they'd be a good story, but they're told so terribly they are ineffective. So can you talk to me, do you have any thoughts or advice on storytelling, on how to tell good stories?
Well, I think they have to be interesting. And I'm a farmer from Kansas. And if you're a farmer from Kansas, you're kind of a natural storyteller because there's nothing to do, especially in the winter. There's nothing to do but sit around and tell stories to each other. So we're storytellers. But, it's one of those situations where you have to have a reason for the story. There has to be a positive outcome. You want to tell stories where you're giving people hope. See, that's what we're doing. In senior living, we're inspiring hope and we're dispelling fear. That's what we're doing. So the resident is fearful of change, and they're curious if they're going to have a better outcome if they come live with us, because they have options today. The big option is stay home or stay home with a caregiver. Use Uber Eats. Don't go into a retirement community. and their predisposition is to not move in. So the more persuasive we are with our stories, the better, because we're persuading this person to take action. So in addition to inspiring hope and dispelling fear, we want to trigger action. We want to hit that point where they go, that could be me. Let me explain, Steve. So when we tell a good story, we're using optimism bias in our behalf. So in other words, the person says to themselves, well, that happened to that person, that happened to Ann, or that happened to Betty, that could happen to me, because we're optimistic about ourselves by our very nature. That's why people smoke and think they're not going to get lung cancer, because that's going to happen to somebody else. Or they drive their car and don't put their seatbelt on, and they think if I crash, I'm not going to get hurt. That'll happen to some. That's optimism bias. So when we tell good stories, we're using optimism bias for the person, because the person can say, well, if that worked for them, it can work for me, because I'm as good as them, or I'm better. Does that make sense?
It does. So, so the bottom line here is I think I'm hearing is have a bank of stories, collect stories. At some point in time, you probably won't need to write down stories, but you need to think about which stories you're going to use in what circumstances. And you use the same stories over and over again a lot, right? Because they're new to the people you're telling them to.
Absolutely. Yeah, I've told the Anne story about the piano 500 times. I mean, I tell that story all the time. And I tell a lot of the stories a lot. And, and I get new ones when like the guy that's here and the guy who put on the 21 pounds. The reason I tell his stories, because when somebody walks up to him, I say, Frank, tell him about what happened. Frank says, I put on 21 pounds. Look at me. So I can use him right there.
And that's like a human story. That story, telling stories with a visual aids or human aids, right? So, and that one other thing I want to just say for those of you who are watching this, you've heard Russell's stories. Steal those, take and use them as your own. Tell those stories about how he's impact, and this is what you can do in your community. Russell, great conversation as always. Thank you for this tutorial on storytelling. And we will be back next week with another 2 great shows.